Okay, hi everybody, welcome. This week for our molecular ML reading group, we thought we would try to go into flow matching. There's been a series of papers for protein design and others, small molecule design, that use flow matching as uh, an extension or continuation of the diffusion-based modeling. And the groups that have used it have said this is easier and it's better and we should do it. But in many of the cases where it's been presented, I feel like there's been a fair amount of either technical math or it's been challenging to sort of appreciate what's different about it from the diffusion-based modeling. So we thought we would take this time to try to dig into it a little bit. I foolishly, or maybe not so foolishly, said, okay, well, I'll offer to present it as a way of trying to make sure I understand it myself. I am certainly not an expert in this, and I think we'll quickly see sort of my limits in my understanding, but I'm hoping this will be somewhat interactive and we can kind of work on it together. So part of what I want to share with you is sort of the perspective that I'm coming with, and hopefully if we get stuck together, then that will be ways that we can go off and learn more about it. And additionally, I can share with you kind of the resources or the path that I've been able to traverse in order to sort of learn about this. So I want to share some of the resources and context that I think I found useful, at least understanding as far as I have. In particular, I want to highlight a couple of resources right away, and I'll make sure to link these into the chat and otherwise. Oh gosh, now I'm sharing my iPad, so I don't know if it'll be possible for me to pull these up quickly, but let me try. So the first is recently interesting. Recently, one of the first authors of the flow matching paper gave a talk at the Vant AI seminar series, and I found that to be quite good. So I'll link to that one as a way of sort of, oh, how do I get back? So maybe the next thing you should do, or maybe even you should log off now and just go listen to Yaroslav Lippman's talk there, because it's quite good. But I think he kind of jumps in having some assumptions of background in sort of ML and ML theory and deep learning. So I was thinking as maybe a bit of context, we could try to motivate why some of the ideas that he presents are particularly exciting. And that might be a way that I can add a little bit of context to it. And then you guys can still go on and sort of get the clear kind of cutting edge version of it from Yarov. And additionally, there's been a couple of other papers that have had kind of rapidly diversified some of the flow matching things into different contexts. There's one paper in particular, or one talk in particular, it's a paper and a talk that I found particularly useful as well. So I'll link to that. I think it's by Tong as last offer. I think it's Alex Tong. And then additionally, I've collected some of the papers and things and kind of grouped them together into a Google Doc. So those three resources, the two talks and sort of the set of papers, I'll definitely share. And that will be a way that you guys can sort of go off and explore more efficiently together. Okay, so the sort of the key ideas that I want to talk about today is, why do neural nets work? Why are we, what's the sort of secret sauce that makes neural nets work? And then how are these ideas leading to flow matching? And additionally, along the way, there's going to be a fair amount of discussion of like probability distributions and sort of generative modeling. So I think I can get a little bit of context on probability theory. Not very gentle, very few equations, but just basically sort of my conceptual understanding of this, which I think may help with as you approach some of the math to have maybe some conceptual framework of it. And then from that, we'll get into work towards flow matching. So the first piece will be sort of ODEs, and then this continuous normalizing flows. And then as additional context, the diffusion-based models, diffusion denoising. And then there's sort of two different formulations of it. So, like what's the key parts that we actually care about from the diffusion-based modeling, and where can we relax them a little bit to get the more general flow matching. Okay, so that's sort of the general plan. Let's see, how do I do new pages here? Okay, so just maybe make sure everybody's on the same page. Flow matching is going to be an extension of normalizing flows, which is a generalization of diffusion-based modeling, which aims to give a way of sampling and scoring from complex distributions. So, you can think of generative modeling as sort of a complex distribution, protein distribution, protein conformations, the distributions over those and things like that. Okay, so one of the key ideas, I guess there's a number of key ideas for deep learning, but I'm going to touch on two of them in particular. The first is auto differentiation. So auto diff is an idea where if you have some function of x that's dependent on some parameters theta, that the idea is that if you want to parameterize the parameters, and you have based on some data, x and y, where this function is going to give you some prediction y, that what you can do is compute the difference between the predicted f of xi is going to give yi, and then we're going to do some like loss function between yi, maybe we'll call this yi hat, the predictions, and the actual yi. And then we want to back propagate this loss to fit the parameters here. And the PyTorch and all the other frameworks, they're set up for trying to help you do this back propagation idea of back propagating the loss through it. And the only sort of mathy part here is that we're basically just using the chain rule. So the idea is that if we have if there's some difference between the prediction and the value between yi and yi hat, that difference becomes like a little vector in the output space. And what we want to do is kind of translate that back into a little vector in, so if this is in like the y space, we want to translate that as a little vector from, the theta that you're currently at to a new theta where you want to be. So, move from, if you want to move your prediction to where it should be, then you should move the parameters a little bit in the other direction. So this is where the auto diff comes in, is we want to move from a change in the parameters in the output space to a change in parameters in the input space. And to do this, if we have a function, very simple, f of x is equal to 2x squared, then in calculus, the chain rule is this sort of very mechanical process where there's these set of rules where you can figure out what the gradient is with respect to any parameter. So df dx, you can apply the chain rule. And so if you think of this as sort of a series of composition of functions, first you square it and then you multiply by 2, that you can do the the derivative of the first times the times the value of the inside one. So I'm not going to go through and drive it, but the idea is that that if you think of functions as sort of a series of applications of sort of a compositions of functions, then you can the PyTorch and other frameworks that are going to help you sort of accumulate the gradient as you go forwards, what you get the loss, and then you back propagate backwards through this sort of chain of steps to get from the output to the input. Okay, so that may not be enough detail if you haven't seen it before, or too much detail if you have. But the idea is that this auto differentiation has been crucial for being able to build complex differentiable functions. So that's idea number one, is sort of a standard way of making attributing the loss or credit assignment, or sort of computing this how to update the parameters with respect to the loss. The second idea that I think has been super important for the deep learning is this idea of doing stochastic gradient descent at scale. So maybe before deep learning, if you had like a random forest, the idea is that you would push all of the data, this big matrix of elements and features, and this big matrix Y of responses, and you could update the parameters by computing the gradient over all of the data that you had here. So you'd get sort of one big data update for going through the whole data set. So that's great. You get kind of a you know which direction you should take a step in because you've measured everything that you've got. This is if we're trying to think about optimizing the Rosetta energy function, this might be akin to computing the predictions over the entire PDB, figuring out how they're all different from the actual PDB structures, and then adjusting the weights of the energy function a little bit so that way they're closer to, so that way the predictions are kind of moving closer to the protein data bank structures. Back in the Coleman lab, we did this 3 times maybe, sort of iteratively, of making tons of predictions, measuring the loss, making a subtle change, and then taking a step. And I think in general, the field of structural biology has been doing this sort of gradient descent on the energy functions through this sort of iterative process of checking everything, making a small systematic change, and then trying to update it. And the obvious challenge here is that as the data becomes more extensive, this just becomes very challenging to sort of figure out how to make those steps. So maybe the second key idea in deep learning is that we don't actually need to know the true gradient of the loss in the parameters. All we really need is to get an unbiased estimate of the gradient, and it's okay if it's stochastic. So the idea is if we have, like, say this is our parameter space theta, we have the true parameters are over here, what we really want. We're currently at a position here that the true gradient might be moving you in the right direction. But the idea is that as long as we take sort of random steps that are on average in the right direction, we'll kind of wander around. And if we are moving more or less in the right direction and it's unbiased, then eventually we'll get there, or at least we'll sort of on average be moving in the right direction. And what that means is that we can use mini batches. So the idea is we don't have to load the entire data set into memory. We don't have to compute predictions and losses over the entire data set all at once. All we have to do is take a subset of the data, compute the loss, take a step in that direction, take another chunk of data, compute the loss and take another step in that direction. And it's a kind of a remarkable fact that the fact that if you're taking a random subset, that's going to give you an unbiased gradient, and then that you're ultimately going to be moving in the right direction. I think it's a kind of magical that it works, and I think people are still trying to figure out, why it works. There's some good arguments that stochasticity is actually important for adding enough noise, and that you end up with finding sort of local minima that are kind of wide basins. And so there's some amount of like entropy regularization. And so you don't find these really narrow minima. If you have enough noise, you kind of bounce out of those and you end up in sort of wider minima. And those, so if you have a loss surface that looks like, something crazy, the true loss surface of the data versus what you really care about might be shifted a little bit, just because your training data might not be perfect. If you're sitting, if you find a very narrow minima, it's possible that that the actual data is not going to be very close to the, if it's a small shift, you could not generalize very well. But if you're in a very, very flat, wide minima, then even if the data distribution shifts relative to the training data and the predictions, that it will continue to generalize. So the stochasticity has this sort of entropy regularization effect. And that's where a lot of the magic in the deep learning come from, is trying to sort of tune that stochasticity. You want it basically as high as you possibly can get before it's unstable. And that allows you to have better generalization. But then, in some cases, you want to have it kind of allow, to find that signal, you need to have kind of cleaner loss signal. So trying to balance the batch size and how big of a step you take in each stochastic gradient move is a way of sort of controlling that stochasticity. Okay, so number one is this sort of how do you backpropagate the loss? And the second is, how do you do this as the data gets bigger and the models get bigger? Okay, so these are sort of the two of the main ingredients that make deep learning work. The third ingredient might be sort of having it map really effectively onto computer hardware. So, being able to make good use of GPUs might be sort of the key third ingredient for this. Okay, so to get back to what we're talking about, this is sort of why do neural networks work? To get towards the flow matching, I want to maybe talk a little bit about towards this sort of continuous normalizing flows in ODEs. Okay, so let's try a new board. So the idea here originally came from a group in Toronto. It was sort of a coincidence that I happened to be in a different department there when I was a postdoc. So I was hearing about this from our friend David Dunevanad, and I'd reached out to him because he had done sort of the early version of kind of a differentiable version of chemical fingerprints, and I was really excited to try it. But he's a wonderful person, and so we got to get to know him. But his student Ricky Chen in his group and David's realized or had this really unique insight that if you look at like a neural network, it has these series of layers, and you think of kind of the input X is getting passed layer through this, especially like recurrent neural networks, where you have basically it adds X plus kind of some modulation factor to get through it. That this ends up looking kind of like a discrete version of a ordinary differential equation. So the idea is that rather than having kind of discrete steps, you have like a vector field, and everywhere in this vector field is telling it sort of which direction to move as it goes through. So rather than taking kind of like steps discretely, you kind of start at the beginning and you kind of get flowed through this sort of continuous network, and you get down here at the end. So this might be like an ODE, they called it neural ODE. And this is like an RNN maybe, or a multi-layer perceptron, or MLP. So this is cool. It's just basically a continuous version of the discrete steps. And what's really, really neat, or at the time that they saw, is that there's so much cool theory and math around differential equations that there is sort of this question of what can we bring over from the ODE world to get there. So there's some really sort of low-hanging fruit. The first was there's like a whole decades of solvers for ODEs. These include like very simple kind of like gradient-based steps, but there's also like higher order solvers that can kind of keep track of where you've been, and then kind of integrate those differences to try to smooth it out. So I don't know how to spell it, but I think it's like the Runkana, and there's stiff solvers, and there's a whole pile of different strategies that people have come up with for solving different types of ordinary differential equations. And many of these you can just take out of the box and apply, and it gives you sort of new algorithms for being able to sort of make the predictions from the start to the bottom. The second big idea that they brought over from ODEs is that in the way that we had this back propagation through the layers as sort of this chain rule, there's a continuous version of chain rule, kind of like you would take like the limit in calculus to get from, like, say, a difference to like a gradient. There's a similar idea of taking like if you have like a path along the ODE and you want to sort of back propagate along that path, there's this idea called an adjoint. So the idea with the adjoint is that for every path forwards, there's an adjoint path backwards that will transport, like, for instance, a gradient from the end to the beginning. And so basically, if you want to know how to change the inputs, so the inputs are the initial conditions in the ODE world, but the initial conditions in sort of the neural ODE world would be like the parameters. And if you wanted to sort of generate a sample, the conditional, like, input features or initial conditions in the beginning. So this might be like if you have like a theta here, the question is, how do you adjust theta to sort of end up at the the right y? So if you start here and you kind of drift off into here, the question is, how do you adjust the theta so that way it kind of moves the predictions over a little bit to get to where it should be? And so basically this idea is that you could, rather than back propagate through the network, you could there's a natural formulation of what the adjoint path should be, and you end up flowing backwards along that adjoint path, and that tells you how to modify the parameters to get down to the bottom. So this is super cool. Basically, it gives you a way of making these RNNs continuous. It opens up sort of new solvers, and we can use some of the theory from the ODEs to think about how to do this back propagation of loss. These work pretty well. They make some really beautiful pictures. But one of the things that was, so this came out in 2018. It was like the best paper at NeurIPS. It brought over this huge, massive infrastructure of ODEs and this connection between differential equations, and brought in a lot of theory from physics. It was just an amazing bridge to make these connections. And through that, we got this sort of these solvers and this sort of strategy for community loss. But in practice, what was problematic about this is that for every time you wanted to update based on even a mini batch, you had to run a whole simulation to get to the output. And what that meant is that it was computationally expensive to run a mini batch through. You had to run a simulation and then kind of run it backwards. And so these two steps, sort of kind of running back and forth through the network, meant that it was just very computationally expensive. It would be kind of like if we were doing a Rosetta simulation, thinking about, okay, well, we've got these initial parameters, which would be like the energy function and the initial starting coordinates. We do a trajectory through Rosetta. We end up with a predicted structure, and now it's not quite right. So what do? We would have to like run the simulation in reverse to get back, and that would allow us to get back to the sort of the initial conditions, which would be the initial coordinates and the initial parameters, but we would have with us sort of the gradient of which way to move differentiate the parameters with respect to the loss. So it's a little bit different than the gradient of the function evaluation of the energy function, like we do for like doing minimization. We use the gradient with respect to the coordinates, and it's not even like the gradient of the energy function with respect to the parameters. It's that we have to sort of feed it all the way through the simulation and then have it come all the way back. Not only is it computationally expensive, but it's these simulations tend to be they're kind of long, and so the if you make a tiny change in the output, they could be kind of chaotic, and so that could end up being like a very big change in the input. And so it meant that in general these trajectories are very stiff, or these ODEs are considered very stiff, and what that means is that we have to just take very small steps, and so it becomes kind of in practice as the dimension grows, it becomes more and more challenging to actually optimize these things. Sorry for the technical challenges here. I don't know what's going on. Let me try sharing again. Any questions while I'm trying to reconnect? Okay, so this was 2018. The theory worked really good. It looked like we were on track for being able to do this sort of ODE flow-based of modeling. But what was sort of missing was a way of effectively training these things in high-dimensional settings, which is where we would want for, say, protein modeling. So the next piece for this is sort of the diffusion-based modeling as a way of getting at higher dimensions, and it builds on some of the ideas of these normalizing flows. So before we get to there, I just want to take one step and sort of connect the ODE format, which is where you start with the initial conditions in this determined path that you take to get to the output, and connect it to sort of a stochastic differential equations, and thinking about how would we handle models that are stochastic. So stochasticity comes up a lot in these generative models. In particular, what we would want is in order to generate, like, say, diverse samples, or especially in probability distributions where we're making the data is from a sample from a probability distribution. And so there's some of these ideas around stochastic networks. We'll take maybe just a moment to talk about some of the ideas that people have come up with for this. So there's in the sort of the standard autodiff format, we have some input X, and we're going to produce some output Y, and here's some F. So we have this this is deterministic. So no matter what F you put in, a Y comes out. but the question is, okay, well, what if we had something like these were that we wanted to generate a sample from like some regression model where we had kind of some Gaussian noise or something like this. So like you could think of the way that you could generate this is that you pick your x, that gives you kind of the mean, and then there's a noise where you would generate kind of a y value given the x. So this you might think of as like a conditional probability distribution, where we have f of y is conditional on x. So that's just saying in this space, we first give it the x, and given the x, then we end up with a little probability distribution around here. And the reason why you might want to do that is if your data is sampled from this regression model, if you wanted to ask what's the likelihood of your data under the model, you would, if you just gave it the mean, it would, there would be no noise there, and so the likelihood of observing the data would be 0 because it's not on the line. But if we have this this little the noise distribution around it, then we would be able to say, oh, okay, well, in the conditional distribution, if we observe like a y value, then we can say, well, what's the probability of that y value in this distribution? So it gives us a way of assessing the likelihood of the data in the model, because we're allowing that sort of stochasticity or that noise that comes out of it. So if we have some noise that comes in, and now we have like the x to the y, where the noise is coming in as part of this linear regression model, or this regression model with noise. The question is, how do you back propagate to the parameters through this stochastic process? And I think there's sort of two general strategies, or maybe three. But the first is that you could take the expectation over the samples from the network. So the expectation here is going to be, well, we're just going to generate a bunch and then kind of take the average of them. So if you wanted to know what the mean was, you could sample a bunch from your network and then back propagate it sort of through each of those samples to get back. A problem with that approach is that you often need to run it multiple times in order to get kind of effective sample size to do that back propagation. So maybe a second approach would be if you have some sort of black box stochastic process, x to y, you could create kind of a variational model that kind of predicts this this process. So this is some stochastic black box prediction. We don't even try to worry about it. We just say that there's some data generation process, and instead what we're going to do is come up with a sort of a set of approximating functions and that are easier to handle, and that we can do back propagating the loss through this. So if this variational family is complex enough, it might be able to capture this process, and there we can we don't have to worry about actually back propagating through it. So you could think of it could be a natural occurring process, like how proteins fold in nature. Rosetta, you could think of as kind of a variational approach because it's more tractable. We could, in principle, figure out how Rosetta works, and we can be able to, kind of control that simulation process. But you could even say, well, maybe Rosetta is too complicated, and we don't really have a good way of back propagating the loss through the simulations, and so maybe we need a kind of a variational model that would say, okay, if we make a change in the Lennard-Jones potential, that makes a change over here, and we can kind of make a regression model that says, okay, if we make this change, then that's how this comes out. And so we could train that variational model kind of as a statistics-based approach and sort of just take Rosetta as the sort of black box simulation process. So these are kind of two extremes. One is you just push your way back through the simulation, and the other is you kind of sidestep it and treat it as a black box. But there's a kind of a third approach, which is quite clever, and that is some forms of stochastic functions can be rewritten so that way the gradient with respect to the thing you care about doesn't depend on the gradient with respect to the noise. So sometimes this is called like there's a trick. It's like it's not the kernel trick, but it's something like this. Maybe one of you on the call remember seeing this.
Is it reparameterization?
It is, yeah, exactly. So just maybe one way to see this is if you have like a Gaussian, you could think of with some parameters theta and then some sigma squared is the variance. Whereas, or maybe let's do it this way. We'll do f of x theta here, right? So we care about adjusting the theta, and this is the noise distribution around it. But this is going to be equivalent to f of x theta plus a Gaussian that doesn't depend on theta or x, and where this is centered at 0 and it has the same noise to it. So if we picture we're trying to come up with the, we could either take lots of samples of a Gaussian distribution with this mean and the standard deviation, or we could rewrite it as like a sum of something that, reparameterize it as this has the stochasticity and this has the parameters. So if we can sort of separate these two different processes, then when we're trying to compute the loss, we just can ignore this piece because, taking the chain rule, it's like a constant because it constant with respect to the parameters. And so it kind of falls away, and it doesn't really matter what it is because we can just keep back propagating the loss straight through without having to worry about the noise. So in this way, there are certain functions that can be effectively reparameterized to handle sort of stochastic evaluation that allow the efficient propagation of signal through a stochastic process. There's a really beautiful paper that kind of lays out sort of a symbolic kind of, these sort of boxes and arrows scheme, and what types of boxes and arrows can be reparameterized and what are the conditions to have them, and these, kind of how do you sort of stitch these different networks together. So it was really helpful for me in sort of thinking about, what type of functions can be supported with this reparameterization trick. But okay, so the reason why I'm sort of spending some time to talk about this is that for the diffusion-based denoising models, we're going to see that reparameterization trick in just a second. So maybe let's open that up. So, this would be a time to sort of recall back to Nick's tutorial in the beginning, but let's maybe sort of reintroduce what the diffusion-based denoising models are doing. If we have some data distribution in our space, let's call this like x1, the idea is that we can take each sample or the samples all together and add noise to them. And in this case, we're going to add Gaussian noise. And depending on sort of how much Gaussian noise we give, we can picture that there's sort of these series of steps that's going to transform the noise transform the actual data distribution into like this, perfectly independent x0, which is going to be effectively something nice, like a Gaussian centered at 0 with some standard deviation, some high dimensional Gaussian distribution. So this process here is the diffusion. And then the idea is that if you can totally destroy all of the structure and get back to a Gaussian, then to sample, you pick a point here in the Gaussian, which you can do easily from sampling from a multivariate Gaussian, and then go backwards through this process. And this is the sort of the running in reverse, and it will generate a sample in the data. So a key step in this process is that rather than running the simulation for each data point, the reparameterization trick says that the sort of the sequential application of Gaussian noise is equivalent to the application of Gaussian noise with just a bigger standard deviation. So it allows you to sort of quickly take a data point, generate a sample at whatever point you want in the along the diffusion process. And I can't mark. Sorry, why? And that allows you to get the point there. And so now we're kind of in this process of like, how do we denoise back? And there's a couple different formulations of it. One is thinking of it kind of as an ODE, where basically we're trying to make sure that as you denoise it, you get back to what you started with. And so you kind of run the denoising process. This is basically a forward direction, or it's an inverse for the denoising, the diffusion, but it's the way that you actually want to do inference. So you want to make that process efficient. And then as the loss is there, then you kind of can adjust the parameters to make it correct. The second is, rather than trying to make it as an ODE, is to think of it as an SDE. And instead, what we try to do is the score matching. So the idea is that instead of having thinking about where it ends up, eventually we can think of this as sort of a I don't know. Let's see. This is our data x1, but we've got kind of a time dimension here. So we have this b1 and we have this back at 0. And so thinking of it kind of as a higher dimensional problem where we have this extra time dimension, that there's going to be a sort of a vector field of how these things are going to move through the time to get back to this point. And so there's a formulation where basically we can get at what this gradient should be once we've done the diffusion. So we diffuse to a certain spot. That's how we generate the position. And then there's the score, which tells us sort of how the gradient should be. And so we can sort of parameterize this whole big block, and that gives us a way of defining like a way of sampling in the forward dimension to get from basically the end, which is the Gaussian, out to the front, which is the complicated data distribution that we care about. Okay, that was sketchy in part because I feel like I don't fully grasp the math here. So if I'm getting incorrect, I'm sincerely apologize. But if anybody has any corrections or confusion, this might be a good chance to make sure that I haven't misspoke, or maybe there's a point that we can get clarified with, folks on the call that understand this better than I do. Okay, I'll take that as either. Yeah, okay. So the key observation for the flow matching in the last few minutes is that the key challenge with the diffusion-based modeling that they were able to sort of overcome is that there's sort of the key parts is one is that the target distribution is nice, or this base distribution is nice. It's fast to sample intermediate points, and that it's possible to generate to get losses to params. How do we do the credit assignment? So the limitations of the diffusion-based modeling, although it works quite well in practice, RF diffusion and then all of the image-based generalization, it seems to be a real breakthrough in terms of making it work. But there's a few key steps or things that are a problem. The first is that there's you can only go to Gaussians, in part because it has to be the certain functional form that supports reparameterization. So like, for instance, if we wanted to start with like a Rosetta sample or something like this, or we wanted to do diffusion where our denoising step was like, molecular dynamics or, something else like that, we'd kind of be out of luck because, we would have to sort of run the simulation. We don't know how to backpropagate. We don't know how to, and because it's stochastic, we would have to sort of either do a variational approach, we'd have to average, or we'd have to have it reparameterizable. And the second is that in practice, there's a sensitivity to the schedules for noising. There's a certain, like, if you go too slow or too fast, it can either take a long time to run these things, or the training is just a little bit dicey. It's not impossible. Certainly a lot of people have got it to work, but it's computationally expensive. And if you do it badly, it can lead to very long sampling times. So there's sort of this trade-off in terms of stability and effective training, and also making sure that it can, you don't have to run it for so long that you have to then run it backwards to get it to where it should go. So sensitive to scheduling and long inference times. And in general, these stochastic processes seem like they're, we've the Gaussian distribution is good. We want to be able to sample from it, but we've basically lost all of the structure in the target space. There's it seems like that's a degree of freedom because we haven't we just basically need to have the connection between the input and the output, but we don't necessarily we could permute everything in the Gaussian, and it would still basically in the formulation for it, we would still be able to sample from it. Okay, so the flow matching. The key idea that that they had in the flow matching paper is that we don't necessarily need to do the Gaussian-based process for the generating the intermediate steps. We can just we can do it in an easier way, which I'll show in a second. And from that, it allows us to sort of get rid of this dependence on having it necessarily be reparameterizable. Okay, so the idea, conceptually, the idea is that we're still going to try to parameterize a flow from, from our target distribution to something else. and in and sort of this remarkable thing, which I think is still kind of a mathematical puzzle, is this idea that when we want to train the target distribution, we're trying to parameterize this full flow, but in a sort of a similar way that we could do the mini batch training from the to learn like the gradient for the neural networks. The idea is, could we do get an unbiased estimator and do sort of this conditional training from just something that makes it more simple. So ultimately, we would want to have this sort of clean flow all the way through. But if we just start at one simple point, they said, okay, well, consider that we just have a Gaussian distribution as our target. What if we just pick some random point and we just flow it to in a straight line to go from the target distribution to the reference distribution, and we just optimize the parameters. We take a step in parameter space, so that way this point gets mapped to that point here. And we just keep doing this with, pick a random point in the target and then map it to some random point in the input. What happens when we average over all of the points? What does this network end up looking like? What does this flow end up looking like? And it turns out in practice, and there's sort of a mathematical formulation, which I'm not going to be able to tell you, mostly because we don't have the mathematical framework yet to describe it, or at least I can't do it, is that this simple training procedure of just linearly mapping it, when you average over all of them, turns into a sort of a pleasant, continuous flow that would be as if you had kind of mapped it in a sort of a nice way in this differential equation from the base to the target. So I guess the formulation that Yurov is saying is that if you have the loss of the flow matching is over some over the full flow of the probability distribution in the target space back, that gradient, the gradient of this flow is equivalent to sort of a sum over, or an expectation over, the conditional flow matching, which is where you basically do it as mini batches of the individual points to get flowed from the target distribution to the back. Okay, so why does this work? It looks like what is happening is that you take a little distribution in the target, and it's a data distribution, so you could think of it as a delta or as like a little Gaussian, and you sort of in order to pick a point here in the middle, it's just a linear progression. So you just pick a time point, you move it out halfway, and then in the stochastic differential formulation, you just try to optimize the vector field at that point to match that direction of that flow, where that conditional flow that goes out. And when you do that, you get a parameterized differential equation, and then to make a sample, once you have that vector field, all you need to do is just sort of flow along that vector field to get out to that target distribution. So we're still basically taking the same ideas from the diffusion modeling, where we were kind of making that predictions along the forward path. The only difference is rather than being restricted to finding that point halfway along the way using the diffusion process of going up through diffusing out and then going back, we're just basically mapping it from the input to the base distribution. So that works. It's very simple. It allows you to not necessarily have a Gaussian here. You can have any distribution you want, and just as long as you can sample from it. So you could think about anything that you can sample from. You can have some other neural network. You can have a more complicated distribution. It could be discrete. It could have any sort of structure you care about. You just have to be able to kind of get here and then do the interpolation from it. So in the last couple of minutes, an advance that I think is sort of makes this work better is that rather than just picking random points in the input and the output and kind of matching them up, you could picture they're kind of crossing each other in all sorts of crazy ways. In practice, what works better is if you pick a mini batch of points in the output, you pick a mini batch of points. This is at time one, the distribution you care about, and this is P, the distribution that you want to sample from. And then rather than just kind of matching up randomly, there's this process called optimal transport, which is basically you just pick the ones that are closest and match those up. And that kind of straightens the paths out. And so there's less crossing. So this network is not, the flow is not as sort of convoluted. In practice, the math works the same. It's just that it trains a little bit easier because these flows are kind of smoother and straighter and less crossings. So the algorithm is you pick some points in your output, you pick some points in your input, you pick some time point t in the middle, you do this optimal transport to figure out which one is matched up which other one. You pick these points in the middle, which are easy because they're just linear interpolations between them. And then your sort of current state of the neural network is giving you a vector field through this, from T1 to T0, or sorry, from T0 to T1, you make sure that the vectors here match the vectors in your vector field. And if they don't, you just move them a little bit using, just the backpropagating the loss just through the network and not through the simulation. And that gives you a really efficient way of adjusting the parameters of the vector field based on the data points, based on these data points that you sampled here. So for each data point in a mini batch, you end up with a subtle change in the vector field parameters. And then once you've got the vector field parameters, to do the full sampling, you pick points here at in P, and then you just sort of flow them back along. They won't flow along these straight lines because that's the conditional flows. But because we've kind of trained one network that's kind of balancing or consistent across all the different mini batches, it will flow along some other path that we haven't even really sampled along before, but it will ultimately generate 2 points out here in this target distribution space. Okay, so we're out of time, and I'm also out of ideas. So just to summarize, there's kind of a tradition of figuring out how to do this credit assignment, how to train these neural networks. There's been a kind of a series of works that have built up through ODEs and stochastic functions that's led to the diffusion denoising, and that this is kind of a next step in figuring out how to train them and how to get around some of the limitations of the diffusion denoising, which is this restriction of having it be Gaussian, and using this reparameterization trick in order to find sort of the steps that we need to do how to do the credit assignment. So I think this idea of using the flow matching is super powerful, and I think we're gonna see it used in other contexts too, perhaps in other types of ways of getting loss from, through complicated distributions. And this going from the conditional loss to the marginal loss, I think, is super clever. And I don't feel like I fully understand it yet of, like what is the math that makes that work. But it's like 3 lines of like kind of Bayesian looking kind of manipulation of probability distributions. So it would be great if we can kind of come up with a clear explanation of why that math makes sense. But in general, the logic of how to do these training is is very straightforward. There's a conditional flow matching library, and they have a number of kind of worked notebook examples. And so I recommend people trying those out and seeing if they can practice with it and see where it actually is working or not working. Okay, so I know I've gone over, and I know I've seen some people leave, but for those who are still around or watching this later, we can any questions or any other thoughts, and we can maybe use those as a way of reading deeply and then coming back and trying to make sense of it better. Okay, I appreciate you sticking around and bearing with me, and we hope to see you next time. And we'll be back to our regular scheduled kind of research updates from cutting edge research. And we're perhaps going to expand out to more broader molecular types of deep learning approaches. I have an interest in small molecules, so we might do some small molecule network and maybe some discrete sampling and things like that too. Okay, thank you.